The morning began like any other, with the slow hum of sprinklers and the faint chatter of neighbors walking their dogs along the suburban sidewalks. The sun was rising over rows of identical homes, each with neatly trimmed lawns and driveways free of clutter. It was the kind of neighborhood the HOA bragged about in brochures, the kind of place they marketed as peaceful, secure, and harmonious. But beneath the polished surface was a constant tension, a power struggle between homeowners and the board that claimed to own them. I lived in the corner lot at the far end of the street, where the trees grew a little taller and the backyard fence sat just a little further back from the sidewalk. My home wasn't extraordinary, but it was mine, and that was enough for me. At least until the HOA decided it wasn't theirs. It started with a knock I didn't hear. By the time I stepped outside, the evidence of their intrusion was already waiting. Taped to my front door was a white envelope with bold red letters. Notice of eviction. The words struck harder than I expected, leaving me frozen on the porch with the morning air chilling my hands. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, as though the envelope itself was a threat. Inside, the letter was filled with sharp language and endless citations of HOA bylaws. According to the board, I had repeatedly violated community standards and had failed to comply with corrective measures. They listed offenses ranging from unsightly lawn maintenance to failure to seek approval for exterior modifications. Each accusation was exaggerated, but together, they painted a picture the HOA was eager to present, that I was unfit to remain in the neighborhood. At the bottom of the notice, in thick block letters, was the line that made my stomach sink. Failure to vacate the premises within 30 days will result in legal action. The absurdity of it all was almost laughable. They wanted to evict me as though I were a tenant living at their mercy. But I wasn't renting this house. I wasn't leasing land from anyone. This was my property, bought with my own hard-earned money, or so I thought. The next days blurred together in a mix of frustration and disbelief. My mailbox filled with more letters, each one escalating in tone, demanding compliance. Neighbors avoided my gaze, some whispering as I passed. It wasn't the first time the HOA had singled someone out, but this was different. They weren't just fining me for tall grass or a visible trash can. They were threatening to take my home. I began collecting every piece of paper, stacking them neatly in a folder I labeled HOA harassment. Late at night, I would sit at my kitchen table, the documents spread out like pieces of a puzzle. I read them again and again, searching for sense in the nonsense, trying to understand how they could justify eviction. The more I read, the more I realized something troubling. The language wasn't just about fines or violations. It was written as though the HOA believed they had ownership over my land. That was the first crack in their story. I dug deeper, pulling out my property deed, the title documents, and the thick folder of papers I had signed years ago when I bought the house. The legal descriptions were complicated, filled with phrases about easements and parcel numbers, but one thing was clear. My name was on the deed. My ownership was not in question. So how could the HOA claim otherwise? Rumors spread quickly. Some neighbors stopped waving when I passed. Others quietly reached out, slipping me sympathetic words when no one else could hear. I learned that I wasn't the first to face the HOA's wrath. A family 2 streets over had sold their home after months of battles. Another had quietly disappeared. Their house quickly repainted and landscaped to fit community standards. The HOA thrived on control, and fear was their sharpest weapon. Still, I refused to let fear dictate my choices. Every letter they sent went straight into my evidence folder. Every accusation was logged. I knew this was headed to court, and I intended to be ready. When the official summons finally arrived, I wasn't surprised. It was written in the same clipped, arrogant tone, demanding my presence in court, on a specific date to determine rightful possession of the property. They were actually going through with it, an eviction trial. The weeks leading up to the court date were some of the hardest I had endured. The HOA increased pressure, sending board members to photograph my yard, measure my fence, even document the color of my shutters. Every day felt like an invasion, like I was living under surveillance. And every night I buried myself in research, combing through property laws, HOA regulations, and past cases. The deeper I dug, the clearer the truth became. The HOA had overstepped. They had assumed authority they didn't possess. And somewhere in their arrogance, they had overlooked a crucial fact about my land that would unravel everything. But at that point, I didn't fully grasp the weight of what I had discovered. I knew I had a strong case, but I didn't yet realize just how much power the truth would hold. The morning of the court date arrived, cold and gray, with storm clouds rolling in across the horizon. As I gathered my folders and evidence, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The HOA believed they had the upper hand. They thought this was the final step in their campaign to push me out. But they were walking into a courtroom where facts mattered more than intimidation. I walked through the courthouse doors that morning with a quiet resolve. I was ready for their accusations, ready for their lies, ready for their smug confidence. What I wasn't ready for, what none of us were ready for, was the moment when the judge would lean forward, study the documents, and ask the question that would turn the entire case upside down. The HOA thought they owned my home. They thought they owned me. But the truth about who actually owned the land was about to change everything. And that was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Courtroom Clash. The courthouse was alive with echoes that morning. The shuffle of shoes across tiled floors, the hushed murmur of attorneys exchanging last-minute words, the heavy slam of oak doors opening and closing with practiced rhythm. For most people, a courtroom was intimidating, a place where nerves, twisted stomachs, and uncertainty clouded every thought. For the HOA, it was a stage, a place they believed their authority could be displayed like a badge of honor. They arrived together, a cluster of board members dressed in stiff suits, their faces painted with smug determination. At their center was Karen, the HOA president, clutching a binder so thick it looked like a weapon. She walked with the confidence of someone who had done this before, who had used fear and paperwork to bend others to her will. Around her, the board whispered and nodded, glancing toward me as though I were already defeated. I sat alone at my table, a single folder neatly stacked with documents I had reviewed 100 times. To the casual observer, I looked outnumbered, perhaps even unprepared. That was exactly what they wanted, to project strength through numbers, to make me feel small. But inside, I was steady. Every sleepless night of preparation, every hour spent combing through property law had led me to this moment. When the bailiff called the court to order, silence fell. The judge entered, an older man with stern eyes and a voice that carried authority without effort. He wasted no time. Papers shuffled and the first motions began. The HOA's attorney rose, his words rehearsed, polished, and dripping with arrogance. He painted me as a careless homeowner who had consistently ignored rules, who had flaunted community standards, who had disrespected the very agreement that allowed me to live in the neighborhood. His tone carried certainty, as though the outcome was inevitable. Every claim they made was matched by pages of evidence, photographs of my yard, letters of violation, records of fines I had refused to pay. They laid out their case piece by piece. A carefully constructed tower meant to convince the court that eviction was not only justified but necessary to preserve the harmony of the community. I listened quietly, resisting the urge to react. The board members smirked, exchanging glances as their attorney spoke. To them, this was the final nail in my coffin. When it was my turn to respond, I stood slowly, placing my folder on the table in front of me. My voice was calm but deliberate, each word chosen with care. I acknowledged the accusations, not with panic or denial, but with facts. I explained the inconsistencies in their claims, the exaggerations, the overreach, and then, piece by piece, I began laying out the documents that told a different story. The first cracks appeared when I presented my deed. The HOA's attorney brushed it aside, insisting the covenants gave the association broad control, but I pressed further, pointing out the exact language of ownership, the legal descriptions that made clear what was mine and what was not. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents with interest. The HOA's attorney grew more animated, trying to redirect, trying to drown my evidence beneath his words. But the judge was no fool. He asked for clarity, and I provided it, calmly explaining how the HOA had misinterpreted their own bylaws. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I pulled out the survey maps, the historical records, the paperwork few people ever bothered to read. These weren't just papers proving I owned my home. They revealed something the HOA had either ignored or never discovered at all. The land beneath my house, and several other lots in the neighborhood, wasn't part of the HOA's authority. It had never been properly transferred into their jurisdiction. Legally, the HOA had no claim to it. They could send letters, issue fines, even threaten court. But when it came down to ownership, they had no ground to stand on. The courtroom shifted as the realization sank in. The board members whispered furiously among themselves. Karen's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flash of unease she couldn't hide. The attorney stammered, trying to recover, insisting there must be an error. But the judge's expression grew colder with each passing moment. For the first time, the HOA was on defense. Their carefully built tower of accusations was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of the truth. As the judge questioned them, it became painfully clear they had overreached. They had assumed control they never legally possessed. Their eviction attempt wasn't just weak, it was baseless. The board sat in silence as the judge demanded clarification. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her knuckles white around the binder she had carried in with such pride. The attorney's arguments grew thinner, less confident, as he scrambled to justify their actions. The hearing didn't end with a ruling that day. The judge called for a continuation, requesting further documentation from both sides before he issued a decision. But the damage was done. The board that had walked in with confidence left with shoulders slumped and faces pale. Their certainty had been shattered, and they knew it. As I gathered my papers and stepped out of the courtroom, I felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. The HOA thought they could intimidate me, overwhelm me, bury me beneath their authority. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had never truly understood the land they were trying to claim. The battle wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted. The next hearing would decide everything, and I was ready to reveal even more. Pieces of evidence they hadn't even considered. Truths that would leave their entire empire in ruins. For Karen and her board, this wasn't just about one homeowner anymore. This was about the exposure of their entire system, the unraveling of the power they had built on intimidation and false authority. And deep down, I knew they feared what was coming next. Chapter 3. The cracks in the HOA's armor. The days after the first hearing were heavy with tension. What had once been a quiet neighborhood filled with morning joggers, children on bicycles, and weekend barbecues now felt divided. The HOA board had retreated into silence, their usual stream of newsletters and announcements suddenly absent from mailboxes. It was as if the courtroom revelation had rattled them so deeply that even their well-oiled propaganda machine had faltered. But the silence didn't mean surrender. It meant plotting. I noticed it first in the way neighbors avoided eye contact. People who once greeted me at the end of the driveway now turned their heads, afraid of being seen as sympathetic. Others whispered in small clusters, conversations halting abruptly when I approached. Karen's influence still held sway even if her confidence had cracked. Fear was her most effective weapon, and fear didn't vanish overnight. Still, there were signs of change. A few brave neighbors slipped me quiet encouragement. One man stopped me under the cover of darkness, speaking in hushed tones about his own battles with the HOA, about fines he had paid just to avoid conflict. A woman from 2 streets over left an unmarked envelope in my mailbox containing copies of notices she had received, each one just as arbitrary and inflated as mine. The stories all followed the same pattern: harassment, intimidation, and eventual submission. The HOA had ruled with unchecked authority for so long that they believed themselves untouchable. But the courtroom had exposed a truth they couldn't hide. Their empire wasn't built on law. It was built on fear, paperwork, and the hope that no one would ever fight back hard enough to question it. I spent my evenings at the kitchen table, the same spot where weeks earlier I had sat with a notice of eviction trembling in my hands. Now the table was covered in organized stacks of evidence, deeds, maps, survey records, and testimonies from neighbors willing to speak up if it came to it. I treated it like preparing for war because, in many ways, it was. The HOA, meanwhile, had begun to show its desperation. Strange cars slowed in front of my house at night, headlights lingering longer than they should. Board members made sudden appearances in my yard, clipboards in hand, pretending to inspect common areas, while clearly documenting everything they could about my property. Notices continued to arrive in my mailbox, each one piling on new accusations: improper lighting fixtures, fence panels out of alignment, trash bins visible for too long. They were trying to bury me under the weight of sheer volume, to prove that even if they couldn't win on ownership, they could drown me in violations. But what they didn't realize was that every notice, every photograph, every accusation was more evidence of harassment. Instead of breaking me down, they were building my case. Behind closed doors, the board grew restless. I heard snippets of their arguments, carried on the wind during one of their late-night meetings in the clubhouse. Voices were raised, accusations thrown. Karen's name came up often, sometimes followed by sharp tones of disagreement. The once united board was splintering, under the weight of their leader's miscalculation. For Karen herself, the cracks showed most in her demeanor. Where once she strutted down the sidewalks with her clipboard, like a queen inspecting her kingdom, she now moved briskly, avoiding eye contact, her posture stiff with barely concealed frustration. Yet her pride would not allow her to admit defeat. I knew she was rallying her forces, preparing for the next hearing, desperate to restore the image of control she had cultivated for years. As the continuation date approached, I returned to the courthouse to submit additional documentation. It was there, in the quiet sterility of the clerk's office, that I uncovered the piece of evidence that would become the nail in the coffin. Buried in county archives was a record most had overlooked. The original land transfer documents from decades before the HOA even existed. The neighborhood had been built in phases, and while many parcels were included in the association's jurisdiction, a handful had slipped through the cracks, due to sloppy paperwork and shifting boundaries. My property, along with a few others, had never been officially annexed into the HOA. This wasn't just a technicality. It was proof that the HOA had no authority over me whatsoever. Their notices, their fines, their eviction threats, all of it was legally meaningless. When I held that document in my hands, I felt the weight of months of harassment lift from my shoulders. They had built their case on nothing but assumption, and now I had the evidence to prove it. Yet victory wasn't just about proving myself right. It was about exposing them. The continuation hearing wouldn't just determine my fate, it would reveal the truth. To the entire neighborhood, the judge's ruling would send shockwaves through the community, stripping the HOA of the power they had abused for so long. The night before the hearing, I barely slept, not out of fear but anticipation. I knew what was coming. I knew what the documents meant. And I knew the board, despite their scrambling, wasn't prepared for the blow they were about to receive. The morning dawned clear and sharp, sunlight cutting across the neighborhood like a spotlight. As I stepped outside with my folder of evidence tucked firmly under my arm, I caught sight of Karen across the street. She stood with two board members, her face set in a mask of confidence that no longer reached her eyes. For a brief moment, our gazes met. She looked away first. That was when I knew. The cracks in the HOA's armor weren't just visible, they were spreading fast. And in the courtroom, under the weight of the truth, those cracks were about to shatter into pieces. Chapter 4. The Evidence That Broke Them. The courthouse felt different the second time. The first hearing had been a stage for the HOA's arrogance, a place where they strutted with binders, full of accusations and smug expressions of certainty. But now, as they shuffled into the room, the confidence was gone. Their smiles were tighter, their voices lower, their eyes darting between one another as though searching for reassurance that simply wasn't there. Karen still led the pack, binder clutched tightly in her arms like a shield. But her movements betrayed her. Her steps were quicker, her jaw set harder, her eyes refusing to linger too, long on anyone else's. She was still trying to project control, but the cracks were there for all to see. I sat at my table, calm, my folder of documents neatly arranged before me. Inside was the evidence I had uncovered in the county archives, the land transfer records that would unravel everything. I didn't need a stack of accusations or a binder overflowing with threats. All I needed was the truth, simple, clear, undeniable. When the judge entered and the hearing began, the HOA's attorney wasted no time. He spoke faster this time, his voice sharper, trying to reestablish authority through sheer force of delivery. He piled on more violations, more fines, more accusations of non-compliance. He argued that even if my deed said one thing, the spirit of the community demanded another. It was a desperate attempt, and it showed. The judge listened patiently, jotting notes, his expression unreadable. Then at last it was my turn. I stood, steady, and laid out the documents with deliberate care. First, the deed to my property. Then, the survey maps. Then, the county land transfer records, the ones that revealed the fatal oversight. I explained in clear, Measured words how the HOA's jurisdiction had never extended to my parcel. How their bylaws, their covenants, their so-called authority simply did not apply to me. The room grew still as the judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, reading the documents carefully. He asked pointed questions, and I answered each one, referencing the exact lines and legal descriptions that supported my case. When he looked up from the papers, his eyes fixed on the HOA's attorney, the question he asked was simple but devastating. On what legal basis does the HOA claim authority over this property? The silence that followed was suffocating. The attorney stammered, flipping through his binder, searching desperately for an answer that wasn't there. He spoke of community standards, of precedent, of intent, but none of it addressed the question. None of it could. The judge pressed further, and the board members began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Karen's face reddened, her hands tightening around the binder until her knuckles went white. The attorney's arguments grew weaker, his voice quieter, until finally he admitted what they had tried so hard to avoid. The HOA had no legal documentation, proving authority over my land. The weight of those words hung heavy in the room. For months they had threatened me, harassed me, fined me, and even attempted to evict me, all without the legal foundation to do so. Everything they had built against me collapsed in that single moment. The judge didn't issue a ruling right then, but he made it clear the HOA's claims were on the brink of collapse. He instructed both parties to submit final briefs before a ruling would be made, but his tone left little doubt. The HOA was standing on air, and everyone knew it. As the hearing ended, the board filed out of the courtroom in silence. Their attorney trailed behind, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. Karen lingered a moment longer, her eyes flicking toward me, a storm of anger and humiliation swirling behind them. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she turned sharply and disappeared through the doors, her clipboard tucked tightly under her arm, as though it were the last piece of control she still held. I walked out of the courthouse with a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. For the first time, the HOA wasn't in control. Their power had been stripped bare, their authority exposed for the illusion it was. Back home, the atmosphere of the neighborhood had shifted. Word traveled fast and whispers spread through the streets. Neighbors who had once avoided me now watched curiously, some with cautious hope, others with quiet admiration. For years, they had endured the HOA's heavy hand, too afraid to resist. Now they were seeing cracks in the wall they had believed unbreakable. In the days that followed, the board scrambled. Notices still appeared in my mailbox, but their tone had changed. They were less confident, less aggressive, as though written more to save face than to enforce rules. The board held emergency meetings late into the night, their lights burning. In the clubhouse long after the streets went quiet. But no matter what they did, they couldn't erase the truth. The land records existed and the judge had seen them. And I wasn't done yet. Because the more I uncovered, the more I realized my case wasn't just about me. The same oversight that freed my property from the HOA's grip applied to others as well. Neighbors who had been fined, harassed, even forced to sell, might have been victims of authority the HOA never truly had. What had started as my personal battle was becoming something bigger. It wasn't just about keeping my home anymore. It was about exposing a system built on intimidation and holding it accountable. The judge's final ruling was still to come. But as I prepared my final brief, I knew one thing for certain. When the gavel finally fell, the HOA wasn't just going to lose their case against me, they were going to lose the iron grip they had held over the entire neighborhood. And Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac, was about to watch her kingdom crumble. Chapter 5. The Neighborhood Awakens. The days following the second hearing were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. For years, the HOA had ruled with absolute authority. Every lawn cut to the same length, every fence painted the same shade, every complaint weaponized into fines. People whispered about Karen and her board, but those whispers never grew into defiance. Fear of retaliation kept everyone in line. But something changed after the courthouse revelation. The HOA's silence, once a symbol of power, became a sign of weakness. People began to ask questions, first in hushed conversations at driveways, then in louder exchanges over backyard fences, and eventually in full gatherings at kitchen tables and garages. It wasn't me who started it, not directly. But the story of the hearing spread like wildfire. Neighbors told it to one another, each retelling adding weight. The HOA had no authority over my land. The judge had questioned their legitimacy. For the first time, the almighty HOA had been forced to stammer and stumble under the weight of its own lies. And in that realization, the neighborhood found its courage. The first cracks appeared when longtime residents, once too afraid to speak, began to openly question their fines. A family who had been forced to tear down their small shed demanded to see the documents proving the HOA's authority. A retired couple who had quietly paid thousands in landscaping. Fines asked for reimbursement. Even the newer homeowners, the ones Karen had always assumed would fall in line, began to question why they were paying dues at all. It was as though the curtain had been pulled back, and everyone could finally see the machinery behind the act. I didn't seek to become a leader in this, but neighbors started knocking on my door. They wanted to see the records I had uncovered. They wanted to know how I had found them. They wanted to know if their properties were subject to the same loophole that freed mine. So I showed them. I pulled out the maps, the deeds, the land transfer documents. I explained how the HOA's jurisdiction had been poorly recorded, how boundary lines had shifted without proper updates, how their reach was not nearly as expansive as they claimed. And as I explained, I saw something in my neighbor's eyes I hadn't seen before, not just relief, but fire. The HOA board noticed the change, of course. Karen especially noticed. She redoubled her efforts, sending out new notices and hosting emergency meetings at the clubhouse. But where once the neighborhood would have fallen in line, now they resisted. Notices were ignored. Meetings were boycotted. Dues went unpaid. And the board, which had always thrived on compliance, began to falter. The clubhouse lights burned later and later into the night, but the outcomes of those meetings were weak. The HOA sent out letters threatening collections, but fewer people cared. They sent out patrols to document supposed violations, but residents met them with cameras of their own, filming their every move, posting videos online for all to see. The very fear the HOA once wielded had turned against them. Karen, once untouchable, became a figure of ridicule. Where she once walked the sidewalks with an air of superiority, now she avoided the public eye, her once proud posture bent with tension. Neighbors whispered not out of fear, but out of mockery. The queen of the cul-de-sac was losing her throne. Meanwhile, I continued preparing my final brief for the judge, but I knew now that the case had grown beyond me. I was no longer just defending my right to live in peace. I was representing every homeowner who had been abused by a system built on intimidation and lies. And the neighborhood was rallying around me. Some brought me documents, fines they had saved for years, letters filled with threats, evidence of the HOA's overreach. Others offered quiet words of encouragement, small tokens of thanks. A few even offered to testify, should it come to that. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood wasn't divided by fear. It was united by resistance. But the HOA wasn't done. If anything, their desperation made them more dangerous. Karen knew her authority was slipping, and she wasn't about to give it up without a fight. Behind the scenes, she and her board scrambled to create new rules, new policies, new ways to maintain control. They tried to fast-track amendments to close the loopholes I had exposed. They tried to rally the most loyal members of the community, painting me as a troublemaker, a selfish outsider threatening the harmony of the neighborhood. But the harder they pushed, the weaker they became. Their every move was scrutinized, questioned, and resisted. Their every attempt to tighten control only highlighted how little control they had left. The tide had turned, and no matter what they did, the current was against them. Yet even as the neighborhood rallied, I knew this was just the beginning. The judge's ruling would be the final blow, the nail in the coffin that would strip the HOA of its false authority once and for all. Until then, we were in a fragile balance, a community awakening to its own power, and a board desperate to hold on to what was slipping away. The courthouse date loomed closer, and the neighborhood watched with anticipation. The judge's gavel would not just decide my fate, but the fate of the entire community, and Karen knew it. In her desperation, she began to plan something bigger, something reckless. The HOA's last stand was coming, and it would not be pretty. The neighborhood had awakened, but the real fight was only just beginning. Chapter 6, The HOA's Last Stand. The courtroom date loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, and the closer it drew, the more desperate the HOA became. For years they had reigned without challenge, their word treated as law, their fines feared like sentences from a judge. But now, with their credibility unraveling and their authority questioned, they were cornered animals, and cornered animals bite. It started subtly. Letters grew more aggressive, printed on heavy paper with bold red stamps, threatening not just fines but liens, lawsuits, and even foreclosure. Residents who had dared to stand beside me received sudden violations for the smallest things: a trash can left an hour too long on the curb, a flower pot that didn't match neighborhood standards, a car parked with one wheel on the sidewalk. The message was clear: resist and you'll be punished. But the neighborhood was no longer afraid. Each new violation was posted online, photographed, and mocked. The HOA's power, once absolute, had become the butt of every joke, and yet their persistence showed just how unwilling they were to let go. Karen, especially, was unraveling. Once the proud face of the HOA, she now looked worn, her sharp smile replaced by tight lips and darting eyes. She began convening board meetings almost nightly, dragging the other members into long sessions. Behind the closed doors of the clubhouse, rumors swirled that she was considering drastic measures, that she had hired lawyers of her own, that she was planning one final strike to reassert dominance before the judge could tear it all away. And then the rumors proved true. 2 weeks before the court date, a letter was delivered to every household. Unlike the usual petty violations or fine notices, this one was different. It was a summons, an emergency vote, a mandatory community meeting to decide the future of the neighborhood. The HOA was making its move. The letter was thick with legal jargon, carefully worded to sound official, even threatening. But beneath the language, the intent was clear. They wanted to rewrite the bylaws. They wanted to retroactively claim authority over properties that had slipped through their grasp. They wanted to bind everyone without exception under their rule. And they wanted to do it before the court could stop them. It was their last stand. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse overflowed. Residents who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years filled the seats, lining the walls, spilling out onto the lawn outside. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation and anger. On one side, Karen and her loyalists, clutching binders and papers, their eyes sharp with determination. On the other, the residents, tired of the years of bullying, ready to finally make their voices heard. Karen opened the meeting with the same tone she always used, commanding, self-assured as though nothing had changed. She spoke of protecting property values, of preserving community standards, of unity, but her words no longer had the same weight. The murmurs in the crowd told the truth. No one trusted her anymore. Then she unveiled the proposal, a sweeping amendment to the HOA's bylaws that would grant the board unprecedented powers, the ability to fine without limit, to place liens without court approval, to dictate not just appearances but even uses of property. And most importantly, it claimed jurisdiction over every parcel of land within a set radius, including mine. It was a bold attempt to rewrite history, to grab power in a single desperate stroke. But the neighborhood was ready. One by one, residents stood up, voices shaking at first, then growing stronger. They spoke of years of abuse, of money drained by arbitrary fines, of sleepless nights spent, worrying about foreclosure over something as petty as a miscolored mailbox. They brought up evidence, waving letters, photographs, even receipts. They turned the meeting into a reckoning. Karen tried to silence them, banging her gavel, demanding order. But the more she tried to control the room, the louder it grew. The clubhouse, once her throne room, had turned into a courtroom of its own, and the verdict was against her. When the vote was finally called, the result was overwhelming. The proposal failed, crushed not by whispers or private doubts, but by the undeniable roar of a community that had found its strength. Karen's face in that moment was something no one would forget. The tightness of her jaw, the way her hand trembled on the gavel, the flicker of disbelief in her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't just losing control, she had lost it. But even in defeat, she wasn't finished. That same night, as the residents left the clubhouse, whispers spread that Karen had already filed an injunction, a last-minute attempt to sway the court. It didn't matter that the neighborhood had rejected her. She was gambling everything on one final roll of the dice. The courtroom showdown that would either secure her authority forever or destroy it completely. The neighborhood braced itself. The days ticked down, each one more tense than the last. Lawsuits and countersuits were filed. Lawyers exchanged volleys of paperwork, and the community hung in suspense. For me, it was the culmination of months of struggle. My evidence was ready. My case was airtight. But I knew the HOA would throw everything they had at the judge, hoping to overwhelm with noise and intimidation. This was no longer just about my home. It was about whether a group built on fear could survive when faced with the truth. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, as though the weather itself reflected the weight of the moment. Neighbors gathered outside the courthouse, not in protest, but in quiet solidarity. They didn't need to speak. Their presence alone was enough. Inside, the judge would hear the final arguments. And when the gavel fell, the truth of who owned the land and who truly held the power would be undeniable. The HOA had made their last stand. Now it was time to see if they could survive the final blow. Chapter 7, The Judge's Verdict. The courthouse carried a solemn air that morning, its heavy stone walls looming like a fortress of truth. For weeks, anticipation had been building, every resident whispering about the outcome. The case was no longer just about me and the HOA. It had become the symbol of whether power, abused in the shadows, could still survive under the glare of daylight. The courtroom itself was packed. Rows of benches overflowed with neighbors, curious citizens, even reporters who had caught wind of the escalating battle. The HOA board sat at one table, their stacks of binders neatly aligned, their lawyers whispering frantically. At the center of it all was Karen, her expression taut, a mixture of defiance and fear. She clutched her papers like they were weapons, as though sheer paperwork could hold back the tide turning against her. I sat on the opposite side, calm but resolute. My own binder was thinner, but each page within it was a blade sharpened by fact. Property records, survey maps, historical deeds, proof, simple, clear, irrefutable. When the judge entered, the murmurs hushed to silence. His presence was commanding, not because of his robes or the gavel in his hand, but because of the weight he carried, the weight of finality. He wasted no time, immediately calling the case. The HOA's lawyers were first to speak. They argued with polished voices, their tone dripping with authority. They painted the HOA as protectors of community values, guardians of property standards, defenders against chaos. They claimed my refusal to comply with their rules was reckless, even dangerous. They presented photographs of my property, annotated with arrows and notes, trying to make every detail seem like a threat to the neighborhood's harmony. Karen's gaze swept the room as her side spoke, as if daring the residents to look away, to abandon me. But the faces in the benches were stone. The community that had once feared her now sat united, silently watching her world crumble. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, carrying the thin binder to the podium. The weight of the moment pressed down, but beneath it was a calm certainty. I didn't need theatrics or long speeches. All I needed was the truth. I began with the history. Decades-old maps, clearly showing the boundaries of the subdivision, and just as clearly, the parcel of land my home stood on lying outside of it. I produced the original deed, weathered by time but unmistakable, predating the HOA's very existence. I laid out tax records, filed year after year, not once connected to their authority. Then came the moment that changed everything. From my binder, I removed a certified copy of the master property record from the county's registrar, the final word in land ownership, and there, in black and white, was the revelation that ended the case. The land didn't just stand outside of the HOA's jurisdiction. It was, in fact, the very lot upon which their community clubhouse had been built. Through years of sloppy filings and overlooked boundaries, the HOA had mistaken their own footing. They had been operating on land that legally they had no right to claim. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward, scrutinizing the document with a sharp eye. The HOA's lawyers shifted uncomfortably, whispering urgently to one another. Karen's face drained of color, her hand frozen mid-grip on her papers. I pressed the point further. Not only was my home outside their control, but technically, the HOA's seat of power, their clubhouse, their meeting grounds, their supposed center of authority, rested on land I owned. The irony was as sharp as it was devastating. The very institution that had sought to evict me was, by law, a tenant on my property. The judge sat in silence for a long moment after I finished, the air in the courtroom thick with tension. Then he turned to the HOA's counsel. "Do you dispute these records?" he asked. The lawyer's voice faltered. He admitted they needed more time to review, to cross-check, to verify. But the judge cut him off. "The chain of ownership is clear. This court accepts the evidence as valid." The gavel struck once, a sound that echoed like thunder. The ruling was swift and absolute. The HOA had no authority over my property. All fines, liens, and threats were null and void. Their attempt at eviction was not just unfounded, but a blatant abuse of power. And because the ownership of the land under their clubhouse was legally mine, the HOA now found itself in a precarious position. Either negotiate fair terms with me or vacate the premises entirely. The courtroom erupted. Neighbors cheered, some even cried, overwhelmed by the sudden collapse of the fear that had ruled their lives for so long. Reporters rushed to scribble notes, their headlines already forming. Karen sat frozen, her world shattered. The gavel that had once been her weapon now lay useless. Her reign was over, undone not by rebellion, but by the very foundation beneath her feet. Outside, the courthouse steps turned into a celebration. Residents gathered, voices rising with joy and relief. For years, they had felt powerless under the HOA's shadow. But today, the spell had been broken. Today, they had seen the truth laid bare. That power built on intimidation cannot withstand the weight of justice. As for me, I stood quietly at the edge watching the scene unfold. Victory wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating Karen or dismantling the HOA. It was about freedom. The simple right to live without fear of unjust authority. In the weeks that followed, the HOA fractured. Members resigned, fines were canceled, lawsuits were dropped. The clubhouse stood empty, its fate uncertain. Some suggested turning it into a community center, open to all without the chains of rigid rules. Others wanted it gone entirely, a reminder erased. Karen, stripped of her power, disappeared from public view. Her name became a cautionary tale, spoken of in hushed tones at block parties and whispered conversations. The woman who once dictated lives now lived in silence. Her authority dissolved like dust in the wind, and my land, my home, remained untouched, free from their reach. Not only had I reclaimed my rights, but I had also reminded everyone of a truth, too, often forgotten. That authority is not inherent, but earned, and when it is abused, it can and will be taken away. The battle with the HOA had begun as a fight over one man's home. But in the end, it became something far larger. It became a symbol, proof that no matter how powerful an institution appears, the truth will always rise and justice will always find its way. The judge's verdict had not just freed me, it had freed the entire neighborhood. And for the first time in years, the streets felt lighter. The weight of fear was gone. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was free. And that, more than anything, was worth every struggle.